Hi, I am so glad to be with you today. Let me center this a little more. Here we go. I am going to be reading to you today, um, as you saw in the title, and The Oath from Frank Peretti. It's a very fascinating book. Also, a little on the thick side, so we'll be reading for a little while, especially with me reading one chapter per day. Um, this book is so good. I have read it about 5 or 6 times personally, and reading this all to you, of course, will make it about the maybe the 6th or 7th time. I've actually lost count how many times I've read this novel, but I absolutely love the story. So I've got many other novels that I can read to you all. So after we are done reading this, if you would like to have some more book reading, you all can let me know, and I would be more than happy. I've got books. I've got more books from Frank Peretti. I've got some books from Ted Decker, and I've got one book from Terry Blackstock. So let's go on ahead and get into the reading. So the story starts out, we read a diary. 27 people died that I know of, and I can only guess that the others fled with whatever they could carry away. I could hear the screams and the shooting all night long, and I dared not venture out. The Reverend Du Bois was left hanging in Hyde Hall until this afternoon. I informed Ben and the others that I would not attend the signing of the charter until the body was removed. So Ben ordered him cut down, taken out, and buried with the others. By late afternoon, the men who remained in Hyde River were back in the mines as if nothing had happened, and I also attended to my business. After nightfall, we gathered in Hyde Hall under cover of darkness and signed the charter. With the signing of our names, we took the oath of silence, so I cannot speak of these things, but only write them secretly. The trouble is over, but I am no happier. I am afraid of what we have done. I am afraid of tomorrow. From the diary of Holly Ann Mayfield, July 19th, 1882. Now, before I continue on, I just want to give you a warning of discretion, because there is some parts in this book that could give children nightmares. They're not overly drastic, but nonetheless, just take discretion, because it's got to do, well, I don't want to give away any info. But there is a mention of some blood, and there is a mention of a little bit of gore. So, but it's just discretion is advised. Okay. Chapter 1, The Killing. She ran, tree limbs and brambles scratching, grabbing, tripping, and slapping her as if they were bony hands reaching for her out of the darkness. The mountainside dropped steeply, and she ran pell-mell, her feet on shore, on pine needles and loose stones. She beat at the limbs with flailing arms, looking for the trail, falling over logs, getting up and darting to the left then the right. A fallen limb caught her ankle and she fell again. Where was the trail? Blood. She reeked of it. It was hot and sticky between her fingers. It had soaked through her shirt and splattered on her khaki pants, so her clothes clung to her. In her right hand, she held a hunting knife in an iron grip, unaware that the tip of the blade was broken off. She had to make it out of these hills. She knew which way she and Cliff had come and where they'd parked the camper. All she had to do was backtrack. She was crying, praying, and babbling. Let him go, let him go. Oh, Jesus, save us. Go away, let him go. As she groped her way along, stooping under limbs, clambering over more logs, and pushing her way through tangled thickets in the dark. At last she found the trail, a narrow, hoof-trodden route of dirt and stone, descending steeply along the hillside, switchbacking through the tall firs and pines. She followed it carefully, not wanting to get lost again. Oh, Jesus, she said. Oh, Jesus, help me. Harold Blythe had no reputation for mercy and no qualms about dragging his whimpering, pleading wife out of the house, through the front yard, and into the street where he tossed her away with as much respect as he would have given a plastic bag filled with garbage. Maggie Blythe tumbled to the street with a yelp, bloody in her palms and elbow on the rough asphalt. Hurt and afraid, she righted herself and sat there, a blubbery, blue-jeaned mess, her tousled blonde hair hanging over her eyes. With the back of her hand, she swept her hair aside and saw her enraged husband walking away from her, a silhouette against the porch light that formed a glaring, dancing streak through her tears. Harold, she cried. Harold Bly, a tall, barrel-chested man, turned 1 foot planted on the top porch step and deigned to look upon his wife one more time. There was no pity in his eyes. In his mid-40s and 20 years her senior, he was and had always been a boss man who did not take kindly to betrayals. He'd enjoyed throwing her into the middle of the street. In fact, he wished that she would get up so he could do it again. It's all over, Maggie, he said with a slight shake of his head. It's a done deal. Her eyes widened in terror. Gasping and whimpering, she struggled to her feet, then ran to him. Harold, please, don't. I'm sorry, Harold, I'm sorry. You think you can go to timing on me and then just say you're sorry? He shouted, then pushed her down the porch steps with such strength that she fell again, letting out a cry the neighbors could hear. Harold, please don't make me go. Please. Too late, Maggie, he said with a wave of his hand, as if passing sentence on her. It's only a matter of time now, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. Now you'd better get out of here, and I mean get way out of here. He turned to go inside, then added, I don't want you around me when it happens. Nobody does. But where can I go? She cried. Well, you should have thought of that a lot sooner. Across the narrow street, a lace curtain was pulled ever so slightly open, and the wife of a mining company foreman watched the drama while her children watched cartoons on a satellite channel. 2 doors down and opposite the Blythe's large brick home, a miner and his wife cracked open their front door and listened together. Harold, they could hear Maggie almost screaming, don't leave me out here. He was just opening the front door, but he turned once more to stab at her with his finger. You stay away from me, Maggie. You come near here and I'll kill you. You hear me? The front door slammed, and now Maggie was alone in the dark. I hope she doesn't come here, the foreman's wife thought, and quickly let go of the lace curtain. The miner and his wife looked at each other, then closed the door quietly, hoping Maggie wouldn't hear the sound. Maggie wiped away the tears that blurred her vision and looked around the neighborhood for any haven, any sign of welcome. Maybe she could go to the Carlsons. No, she saw the parlor curtains of their turn-of-the-century home being drawn across the windows. The Brannings. No, across the street she saw the porch light, then the living room light of their right house blink out. It was a clear July night, and Maggie realized that most of the neighborhood must have heard the argument. None of the neighbors would open the door to her. They wouldn't risk Harold's wrath. Despite the warmth of the evening, Maggie felt cold, and she folded her arms close to her body. She looked down the steep hill toward the rest of the little has-been town, and felt no warmth from the tight rows of metal-roofed homes and aging businesses. The roof lines with their chimneys looked like night-blackened saw teeth against the moonlit mountainside beyond. There was hardly a light on anywhere. Suddenly, Maggie realized she was a stranger now, and to any stranger, Hyde River could be a cold and sharp-edged place. She wandered fearfully down the hill toward the highway that ran through town, her hand going to her heart as if feeling a deep pain. She looked behind, then ahead, then into the black sky, where stars twinkled benignly between the high mountain ridges. She stared for a long moment at the Hyde Mining Company, an immense concrete citadel just across the river, now black against the sky. In her terror-crazed imagination, the windows of the old building were eyes, and the huge doors mouths, and it was sizing her up for a meal. She was sure she even saw it move. She quickened her step, looking over her shoulder, then toward the sky again, as if some unseen monster lurked there. She came to the Hyde River Road, the narrow two-lane highway that ran through the core of the town and meandered south through 30 miles of deep valley to the town of West Fork, and beyond that to the outside world. Just a few blocks up the highway, the town put on its best face. There, young businesses clustered around a four-way stop. Down the highway in the opposite direction was the old part of town. It had been through a lot more winters, had hung tough through a century of booms and busts, made no apologies for the age. Maggie hurried up the highway toward the newer section of town, through the four-way stop and past the small businesses, the True Value Hardware and the Chevron station, Charlie's Tavern still open, and Denning's Mercantile. Beyond these, the town was a steadily decaying parade of ramshackle homes, boarded-up storefronts, dismembered pickup trucks, and rusted mine equipment. Finally, she came to the McCoy's mobile home, a windowed metal shoebox with no wheels, perched and sagging on pier blocks and concrete-filled oil drums. The ruined roof now supplemented by heavy blue tarps. Maggie could see Bertha McCoy peering out at her through her kitchen window. When their eyes met, Bertha's face quickly disappeared. Maggie approached the toy-strewn front yard. Grizz and Tony, the McCoys' two mongrels, barked at her, which set the other dogs in the neighborhood barking. A knock on the door by this time would be only a matter of courtesy. The McCoys had to know someone was there. Maggie knocked, just a few timid taps, and Bertha called from inside. "What do you want?" "Bertha? Bertha, it's Maggie." "What do you want?" Maggie hesitated, flustered. What she wanted was nothing she felt comfortable shouting through a door. "Can I talk to you a minute?" Then came a man's voice. "Who is it?" And Bertha's voice replied, "Maggie Bly." "What's she doing here?" the man's voice asked. Then the two voices muttered in a hushed discussion while the door remained shut. Finally, the man called, "What are you doing here, Maggie?" I She looked around with fear-ridden eyes. "I can't stay out here." "Then go home." "I can't. Harold," she had to say it. "Harold kicked me out." Elmer McCoy, once a foreman for Hyde Mining, was well acquainted with Harold Bly, and Maggie could hear it in the strained tone of his voice. "Maggie, we've got no quarrel with either one of you, and we don't want one now." Maggie pressed closely against the door as if for protection. All around the town lay in the cold gray colors of night, and to her, every darkened window, every shadow seemed to be hiding something sinister. "Elmer, if you could just let me in for a while." She could hear Bertha begging Elmer in a voice that quivered with fear. "Elmer, don't let her in here." "Go away, Maggie," he yelled through the door. "Please." Elmer's voice sounded frightened as he said, "Go away, you hear me? We don't want any trouble." She turned away, and the dogs barked at her until she was out of sight. Evelyn Benson stayed on the steep trail for miles, taking step after jarring downhill step, until at last the trail emptied onto the logging road she and Cliff had followed. Having made it this far, her desperation gave way to exhaustion. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the ground on the side of the road, too numb with shock to weep, too emotionally spent to pray. By now, the blood that soaked her clothing had mingled with sweat, and the night wind drew heat from her body until she began to shiver. "Go away!" Carlotta Nelson hissed from behind the door of the small one-story house. "Please, Carlotta, let me in. I can't stay out here," Maggie cried, standing on the front porch and clinging to the knob of the closed door. Carlotta Nelson and Rosie Carson, semi-cute and not quite young anymore, were still the town's favorite ladies and determined to stay that way. "I can't let you in here," Carlotta replied. "Not if Harold kicked you out. You ought to know that." "Carlotta, I'm scared." Carlotta, her long blonde hair pulled back in a loose braid, exchanged a worried look with Rosie, a petite, freckled redhead. Carlotta had her hand on the doorknob, not to open it, but to be sure it wouldn't turn. Rosie was near the door only because she could hide behind Carlotta. Well, we're scared too. You follow?" she shouted over Carlotta's shoulder. "Just let me in for the night," Maggie pleaded. "I'm dead if I stay out here." "Dead? Did she say dead?" Carlotta shot a look of terror at Rosie, and Rosie shot it right back. Only a wooden door stood between them and the worst kind of trouble. "That's your problem," Carlotta said, and now her voice was quivering. "And you can take it somewhere else, you hear? Now get out of here." Maggie was weeping again. "Please let me in. I'll leave in the morning, I promise." Her plea was met with silence. Finally, Maggie turned and in a stupor of fear drifted down the porch steps to the main sidewalk. staying close to buildings, cars, and trees, continually looking over her shoulder toward the sky and down the highway. Had he not been forced to slow down due to the poor condition of the road, the trucker would never have seen Evelyn in time. As it was, he had to brake quickly when his headlights caught her, lying like a bloody corpse on the road. He brought his logging rig to a grinding, growling halt about 10 feet away from the prone body. As he eased himself down from the cab, the trucker could already feel himself starting to shake. It was dark, he was alone, and there could be more to this situation than he could see in his headlights. He approached the motionless body warily, expecting the worst. A hunting accident or a bear attack, maybe a raped, mutilated body dumped by some pervert. He glanced over his shoulder. What if the attacker was still in the area? Hello? He called tentatively. Evelyn stirred and moaned into the ground. The trucker quickened his step. Reaching her, he stooped down and gently turned her over. She was limp, her eyes closed, her face waxen. He cradled her head and felt her neck. Her pulse was strong, her breathing normal. Ma'am, can you hear me? She awoke with a start. Evelyn was not aware of who she was, where she was, or who was holding her. All that registered in her mind were the truck's imposing grille, the rumbling diesel engine, and especially the glaring headlights. They looked like eyes to her. With a terrible shriek, she broke free from the trucker and leaped to her feet, staggering with exhaustion, stained with blood, her right hand wielding her knife, the broken blade flashing in the headlights. The trucker, fearful for his own safety, scrambled away from her, away from that blade. Stunned, he stood in the road watching the woman as, with crazed eyes and a cougar-like scream, she assaulted his truck with the knife, shrieking, kicking, lashing at the big machine, the blade clanging over the grill. Then, realizing that she was going to hurt herself, the trucker leapt forward and grabbed her, pulling her away from the truck. She kicked and screamed and almost sliced his ear off. Vic Moore, tall, bearded, and burly, didn't need any trouble either. Finding work in Hyde Valley wasn't easy these days, especially for a contractor. Well, he had managed to keep food on the table, which said something for his strength and cleverness. He'd also managed to stay married to the same woman for going on 6 years, which in itself was quite an accomplishment, and said something for Carlotta Nelson's ability to keep a secret. So things were going fine, thank you, and could only get better from here. At least that was what he thought until that night. He was just getting ready for bed, standing bare-chested in front of the bathroom sink, when he noticed what looked like a rash or some broken blood vessels directly over his heart. He leaned toward the mirror, trying to get a better angle to study the strange mark. It seemed to have a lacy, vein-like pattern to it and covered an area over his breastbone, an inch or so wide and a little longer than the width of his hand. What in the world was this? He wondered. From somewhere deep in his memory, an answer surfaced, and the heart just beneath that mark began to pound faster. Vic grabbed the edge of the sink to steady himself. His head began to swim as reason and logic fought against fear and denial. This mark, this blemish, couldn't be what he thought it might be. He didn't believe all that stuff he had heard since he was a kid. No, he'd just pulled a muscle or something, broken a couple of blood vessels, swinging a hammer or lifting a radial arm saw. He'd been working hard lately. A loud knock at the front door made him jump. There was a moment of silence, followed by desperate pounding. Dottie, his wife, was in the shower, and he knew she couldn't hear the knock. Vic cursed the bad timing. Who in the world? He had to cover himself. He couldn't let anyone see. Oh, come on, he told himself. Just put your shirt on. It's no big deal. He put on his shirt, which was hanging on a hook on the back of the bathroom door. For good measure, he grabbed his robe, too. The pounding continued, and as Vic crossed his living room toward the front door, tying his robe as he ran, he could hear a voice. Hello? Hello? Please, somebody. Uh-oh, it sounded like Maggie Bly. He swung the door open. Maggie almost knocked him over as she pushed her way inside and held him, practically climbed him in terror. Vic, let me in! Let me in! Vic was startled, then angry. Maggie, what are you doing? What is this? She held on to him, her eyes fixed on the front door as if something had chased her inside. Her words tumbled out like those of a frightened child. Vic, you gotta let me stay here. I won't be any trouble. Let me stay here, please. I can't go out there. Maggie, now calm down, he hissed, forcibly breaking her hold on him. And pipe down, will you? I've got Dottie and the kids here. Don't want to get them all upset. Maggie tried to quiet down, but her voice was still high-pitched with terror. Please, just don't make me go out there. Vic looked toward the hallway leading to the bathroom. He could still hear the shower running. He was getting nervous. What's the matter? What happened? Maggie rubbed the area over her heart as if trying to ease a pain. Harold kicked me out. Vic saw what she did as he heard what she said, and he was frightened. She leaned toward him. He backed away. Easy, Maggie, easy. Harold kicked you out? What for? She stood there just crying, not looking at him. Vic insisted. Why'd he kick you out? I've never had this happen to me before, she said, sidestepping the question. Vic got the picture, and his face tightened with fear. He stepped to the door and swung it all the way open. Out! Her death sentence. Vic, out now! She clasped her hands in front of her imploringly. Vic, don't you know what's out there? He lowered his voice to a whisper, hoping she would take the cue. It's gonna stay out there. You're not bringing it in here. I didn't mean it. Vic's speech accelerated as he grew more agitated. Maggie, whatever you're doing, it's got nothing to do with me, and it's got nothing to do with Dottie or my kids. Now get out of here. She hesitated, trembling, unable or unwilling to move. Vic knew he had to get her out of his house, and quickly. Reaching out, he grabbed her by the arm, then dragged her toward the door. She let out a cry. Shut up, he hissed, and then he threw her out. He closed the door and bolted it. The shower had stopped. A few moments later, Dottie, a lovely woman wearing a towel on her head and a robe, walked into the living room. Who was that? She asked her husband with some concern. Vic had been standing in the middle of the room looking at the door, waiting to see if Maggie would dare come back. As he turned to face his wife, he couldn't hide the fact that he was quite upset. Stupid kids throwing rocks. What did you do? I chased them off. Did you see who they were? Nah, it's too dark. She was about to ask another question, but he brushed past her, scratching an itch over his heart as he walked out of the room. He wanted to get to bed, to turn the lights out, and to put this day behind him. He didn't want to answer any more questions. Maggie came at last to Cobb's garage, formerly an old mining company fire station, haphazardly constructed of stone and brick with two huge wooden doors on iron hinges. The lights were on. Levi was working late. She went to the side entrance and, with no thought of knocking, tried the door. Finding it unlocked, she entered quickly, slammed the door shut behind her, and leaned against it. Her mind was set. Levi Cobb might pick her up and throw her out, but she would not leave on her own. She would not be outside for one more minute. A utility truck from the phone company was sitting up on jacks, and Maggie spotted Levi just beyond the back end of the truck by the cluttered workbench. A bearded, graying, heavy-set fellow with wire-rimmed glasses and the huge arms of a laborer. He was holding a welding torch in one hand and just raising his welder's mask to see who had come in. At the sight of her standing against the door, holding it shut, trembling and disheveled, he cocked his head. Mrs. Bly? Steve Benson had gotten a call from Evelyn's mother in the middle of the night and arrived at the Clark County Medical Center in West Fork before 2 o'clock the next afternoon. He could sense fatigue chasing him down the hospital corridor, but he knew he had the stamina to outrun it. He strode down the hallway, weaving past patients in wheelchairs, past nurses and doctors, intent on finding room 31. He was aware of people staring at him as he passed. A towering man dressed in rugged outdoor clothes. He knew he looked out of place in that white, sterile environment. And yes, he did look like he'd driven half the night, his face of blackened stubble and his eyes glazed and intense. They could steal all they wanted, he thought. His priority was to see Evelyn and find out if his brother Cliff had been located. He spotted the nurse's station and the sheriff's deputy waiting there for him. At least she was dressed like one. At the sight of her, his impatience ran up another notch. What was the sheriff's department thinking? Ah, the Cliff Benson thing's no big deal, only a minor case. Send the girl. She looked to Steve like a green as grass rookie. Auburn hair trimmed neatly at the neck and not a hair out of place, as if she'd never done a moment's police work. Lean, fit build, a china doll face. He also noticed she looked ill at ease, round up, like it was her first day on the job. Great, just great. She was looking his way. Don't try to stop me, young lady. Can I help you? She asked, walking toward him. I'm Steve Benson, he said, coming to a halt to keep from running over her. Mrs. Benson's brother-in-law? That's right, he answered, letting her shake his hand, but already looking past her, toward the corridor beyond, anxious to see Evelyn. I'm Tracy Ellis. The county, I'm with the Clark County Sheriff's Department, she was saying. Yeah, she was nervous, all right. It was understandable. Evelyn's mother said you were coming. So you're the brother of the, Steve finally gave her his full attention, if only to get around her. Cliff Benson is my brother. She seemed to grope for her next question. Are you alone? Has anyone come with you? I'm alone. Let's cut to the chase here. I want to see my sister-in-law, and I want to know if you found my brother. She read his face and his tone, dropped her eyes for a moment, then finally said, Evelyn is alive, safe, sedated. No serious injuries. She was cut and bruised and in shock when the truck driver brought her in, but she's resting now. She'll be all right. Steve did not miss the fact that she had told him only about Evelyn, but before he could speak, she touched his arm. Could we sit down first, just for a moment? What for? She only answered gently, "Come on," and led him to a reading area just off the hallway, a spacious room with comfortable chairs, People magazines, big windows. He sank into a soft chair by the window, a chair already warmed by the afternoon sun. It felt better than he had expected. His body was giving him hints about needing rest, hints he'd been ignoring. Tracy Alice pulled a chair over so she could sit opposite and close. She was holding a folder, no doubt the details of the case gathered thus far, Steve thought. But he noticed she didn't open it. Instead, she just looked. He could see she was struggling to find words, but her expression said enough. He could read the truth in her eyes, feel it pouring into his guts, overpowering his hopes, dashing his strongest desires to not to believe. Is my brother dead? She still hesitated. Finally, she said, we need a positive identification of the body. But yes, it's almost certain that your brother Cliff is dead. A flicker of hope returned, but only to torment him. What what do you mean almost certain? She quickly opened the folder and scanned her notes for specific information. Did She flipped to another page. Your brother Cliff have a scar on his right leg, on the right side of his thigh. Steve took a deep breath. He could feel himself going numb. Her face was full of apology, but she was waiting for an answer. He nodded. He shot himself in the leg with a pistol when he was 16. He was trying to show me his quick draw. He could see it all. The hand-drawn paper target tacked to the old oak tree out behind the house. Cliff, tall and gangly, with that holster tied to his leg and that dripping cowboy hat. Clint Eastwood, move over. He was a crazy kid, and I loved him for it. I'm so sorry. What happened? We're not sure. Last night a truck driver found Mrs. Benson alone on a logging road up on Wells Peak. She was in shock and incoherent, but had some ID on her. We called her home and found out from one of her sons that she and your brother had gone camping together. We found your brother's body on Wells Peak early this morning. She paused and said carefully, by the looks of things, we think he may have been the victim of a bear attack. May have been. You can't tell a bear attack when you see it. His tone was sharp. He was in such pain he couldn't help it. He noticed that she took it well, remaining calm and pleasant though visibly tense. We don't have all the information yet. First of all, bear attacks, if that's what this was, are extremely rare around here. At least the reported bear attacks. And she hated to admit this. We've never established a procedure for expediting a case of this sort. In this part of the country, it takes time to gather the personnel and work out the logistics. Now, your brother's body was taken to the morgue in Oak Springs. That's over the pass, about 30 miles from here. The autopsy is scheduled for tomorrow, and we're hoping the country medical examiner can make a determination. In the meantime, we've contacted the Department of Fish and Game, and they're going to get some people out here. Marcus Dufresne? She stopped. Excuse me? The conservation officer with Fish and Game. It's Marcus Dufresne, isn't it? She cocked her head. You know him? We've worked together. I helped him tag some bears last year. Is he on this case? She hesitated just a little, but replied, "Yes, I think he is." Nervously running his hands through his straight black hair, he said, "I'd better get in touch with him then. We've got to get right on this before the signs fade, before we lose the evidence." "Well, I'm sure Mr. Dufresne is well qualified." "We both are. I'll take both of us. He'll take both of us." Steve was aware he was talking too loud, too fast, but he couldn't stop himself. It was as if he were putting all his pain and anger into a course of action, into something he could control. "Mr. Benson," she raised her hand to cut him short, "give us some time. You're too close to this." "We don't have time," he snapped. "If this was a bear attack, the signs could fade within hours." "There are qualified people working on this." "You want qualifications? Is that it?" Steve said, raising his voice. "Would a PhD in biological science be good enough for you? How about a professorship at Colorado State University teaching environmental science and biology?" "I know bears, Deputy. I've specialized in grizzly and black bear behavior for the past 10 years. I've consulted with the National Park Service. I've chaired 12 boards of inquiry into bear attacks. I'm currently doing research on grizzly habitat and seasonal use in Glacier National Park. As a matter of fact, I'm even in the process of writing down some of what I know, and you can read all about it when I finish my book. But for now, I've got a brother killed and a possible rogue bear responsible." And he stopped, exhaled for a long sigh, and leaned forward, resting his head on his fingertips. He had gone too far, and he knew it. Her calm and soothing response was much to her credit. "Dr. Benson, why don't we get you in to see your sister-in-law? We can talk more after you see her." His tone was softer, apologetic. "I would greatly appreciate that." She was more than just an in-law. Steve had known Evelyn long before she'd fallen for Cliff. He'd even dated her a few times himself. She was a longtime friend, a kid sister, a tease, with just enough edge to make her perfect for a guy like Cliff. As he stole quietly into her hospital room, he saw her mother, Audrey Miller, sitting beside the bed holding her hand. A bouquet of flowers was on the bedside table, and classical music was playing softly from the built-in radio. Steve didn't know what to expect, but when he saw Evelyn lying on the right sheets, pale and weak, but safe and cared for, the sweet knowledge that she was alive overwhelmed him, and he began to cry. Audrey turned, and her face lit up. She spoke in a hushed, bedside voice. "Steve, oh, hello." And then she rose and embraced him as tears filled her eyes. They held each other for as long as it took to exchange comfort, sorrow, understanding. There were no words. What could he say? Steve thought. He looked at Evelyn. Her face was turned his way, but her expression was listless. She gave no hint that she recognized him. Audrey kept one arm around Steve as she followed his gaze to the bed. "She's still in shock, I think." Steve approached, bent down, and looked into Evelyn's eyes. "Evie," he said softly, "it's Steve." And for a moment there was no response. Then, like a delayed reaction, her eyes came to life and looked into his. Her lips quivered slightly, then formed a very weak and slurred "Steve." She'd been through something horrible, Steve thought. Her curly black hair was still matted with dry blood, her face and hands marred with cuts and bruises. Gently he placed his hand on hers. She managed to wrap her thumb around one of his fingers, and then slowly she smiled. It wasn't even close to the usual Evelyn smile that could light up a room, but Steve welcomed the sight of it. "How you doing, kid?" For a moment it seemed she hadn't heard him. Then she said, "Cliff is dead." Her eyes grew watery, but she seemed so far away, so out of touch with her emotions and her direct situation, that her words came out in a dull monotone, a stupid statement of fact. "Just rest, Evie. We're all here now." She smiled weakly and gave his finger a barely discernible squeeze. Audrey spoke in the same hushed voice. "Samuel and Travis are staying with us. They were just here. They went home with their grandpa." Samuel and Travis, ages 15 and 18. Good boys, well raised, Steve thought. Evelyn wouldn't be alone. He patted Evelyn's hand in a gentle goodbye. "I'll be back. I'm going to go out and talk to the deputy now. You take care." "You too," she managed to say. Steve and Tracy Ellis found a conference room and sat at one end of the long table. Tracy was hesitant. "How are you doing?" Even the thought of answering that question brought Steve's emotions to the surface. He just shook his head, afraid to answer for fear he would lose control. "We can wait on this." "No." He sat up straighter and wiped away the tears that were forming at the corners of his eyes. "No, we've got to get going on it. We can't waste any more time." She toyed with the pen in her hand and said softly, "All right." Something about her made him ask, "And how are you doing?" "I'm..." She opened her folder again, perhaps just for something to do. "I'm not very fine. You may have gathered." "Well, these are not exactly fine circumstances." She shook her head with a weak smile of agreement. "No, they sure aren't. And things are going to get rougher before they get better. I think you need to brace yourself." "I'm working on it," he said, then changed the subject. "Has Evelyn been able to tell you anything about what happened?" "I was going to ask you the same thing." He shook his head. "No, she's really out of it right now." "That's best, believe me." Tracy had the folder open on the table and was perusing what information she had. A truck driver found her on the logging road up on Rails Peak. She began unfolding a Forest Service map of the area. Steve pulled his chair around so they could both view it right side up. "She was incoherent, hysterical, covered with blood. She still had a hunting knife in her hand, and the truck driver says she attacked his truck, ran after it with the knife." Steve leaned forward at that. "Excuse me?" Tracy scanned her notes and pointed to the quote from the truck driver. "I thought she was unconscious, but then when she saw my truck, she jumped up screaming and started attacking it, trying to stab it. When I talked to the trucker, he was quite agitated. He'd never seen anything like it. He said he had to wrestle her off his truck and she just about stabbed him." Steve was trying to imagine Evelyn doing such a thing. She was an even-tempered woman, mature and responsible. More importantly, she and Cliff were experienced in the outdoors. Evelyn had hunted with Cliff, had shot and dressed out game, including a large black bear during a trip in Montana. She could be quite protective of people she loved, and she was no pushover. But this reported behavior was not Evelyn. Tracy outlined the area on the map. "He found her about here. up this logging road. It's about 12 miles above the town of Hyde River. She and her husband were camping near the ridge right here, near the end of the staircase trail. No one's ever seen a grizzly on Rails Peak, but the fish and game people are guessing it might be a large bear. It's tagged number 318. He's been sighted. Well, not near Rails Peak at all, but she pointed to another mountainous area at least 30 miles to the north. Up in here, in the North Paddocks Range. Steve studied the map. That's not unusual. Grizzlies can travel pretty far when foraging. Does anyone know if this bear is habitated, used to people? I understand he's getting that way, and that's what makes him a prime suspect. He's raided the landfill near Swift Water. She pointed out the tiny village on the map again, some 30 miles north of Rails Peak. And a few homesteads there have had their garbage gone through. Tracy shook her head, her expression troubled. But this attack, well, nobody expected it. Has anyone checked the site of the attack? Her shoulders sagged and she looked uncomfortable. Sheriff Collins and I ran up there this morning first light, she said. We didn't know what we were looking for. We knew Mrs. Benson had come down the staircase trail, and we knew there'd been trouble, but she paused. Dr. Benson, it wasn't pretty. He knew she was trying to protect him, but he needed to hear the truth. Go ahead. She fumbled just a little, leafed through her notes, and groped for words. We found the campsite, a small tent, a fire pit some distance downhill, 2 backpacks. The food provisions were properly stored in containers and some trees far from the camp, again, downhill. Hung on a rope stretched between 2 trees, Steve suggested. Tracy nodded. That's right. At least 17 feet off of the ground. Exactly. Yeah, Cliff and Evelyn always did that. It was a standard method for protecting food stores and campers from scavenging bears. Not only was the food inaccessible, it was also far from the actual campsite and downhill, which meant downwind at night. So far, Steve thought, they'd done all the right things. Tracy found a crude map of the site she'd made while there. She handed it to Steve. But that's where we found your brother's body. Down here near the food stores in a grove of trees about 80 yards from the camp. The spot was marked with an X. Both Cliff and the bear could have been at the food cache at the same time for the same reason and surprised each other, Steve thought. We called the coroner, and he and I packed the body out. It was transported over to Carson General Hospital in Oak Springs for autopsy. We should have the report by sometime tomorrow. Tracy gathered up the notes, put them back in the folder, and closed it with a snap. Steve could see that she was finished giving him information, at least for now, so he let it rest. Considering the day she's had, the horror she'd seen, the gruesome task of packing Cliff's body out of the mountains, he didn't blame her. She had done a good job, too. He was beginning to realize that he had misjudged her. You've had quite a day, he said quietly. Yes, sir, and I'm terribly sorry. Thank you. More awkward silence. That had to be quite a job carrying Cliff out of there. Cliff was a big man, as tall as Steve and heavier. That didn't seem to comfort her. She sat there looking down at the photo and nervously biting her lower lip. Finally asked, so what are your plans? I'll need to see he was going to say he'd need to see the autopsy report, but this was Cliff he was talking about. Cliff's body. He didn't want to envision it. He'd seen what a grizzly could do. He'd seen a jaw removed with one swipe of the 6-inch claws, an arm torn away and eaten while the victim was still alive, a complete face lying in a bloody heap in the reeds, a child's body opened and emptied from the pelvis to the rib cage. No amount of time could dim the images, the sounds, the smells. Cliff dying that way? Steve had to block out any thought of it. I think someone needs to read the autopsy report and let me know the conclusions. I might look into it myself, but right now I just don't know. Vaguely, he noted that she seemed to be relieved to hear he didn't want to read the report. But at any rate, he continued, I do need to contact Marcus Dufresne. I won't be surprised if he contacts me first once he finds out who the victim was, but we'll get on with it. She smiled at him. He was struck by the warmth, the comfort her smile gave him. She stood and said, if you're planning on staying in the area for a while, I could recommend the Tamarack Motel here in West Fork. It's not the Holiday Inn, but it's quaint and it's clean. I could get in touch with Marcus and let him know you're here. And then if you'd like, I could take both of you up to the site tomorrow, let you look it over. But Steve was thinking about the passage of time and what that did to a trail, to signs a bear might leave behind. He was thinking about nature's way of cleaning up campsite, rain, sun, wind, and scavenging animals, all of which could quickly erase vital clues to what had happened. He looked up at Deputy Tracy Alice, who appeared tired, who'd already been up to the site and back. Then he looked at his watch, considering the remaining daylight, and made a decision. How long would it take to get up there? Tomorrow I will be getting started on chapter 2, and it continues to get interesting, and the suspense continues to grow. And I would like to encourage you all to come and listen to chapter 2 of The Oath. Like I said, it is a very interesting novel. I absolutely love it. It is a great suspense, and it does leave you hanging just for a little while, But toward the end, it really gets crazy. It's a fun book. I love it. So anyway, I hope that you all have enjoyed the first chapter and that it has piqued your interest, and that you will join me tomorrow in the reading of chapter 2, and kind of spread the word around that there's a book being read called The Oath from Frank Peretti, and that so far it sounds pretty interesting. Anyway, I appreciate you all for viewing. Thank you very, very, very much. And I hope to see you tomorrow in the reading of chapter 2. And you all have a wonderful day.